All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a moment. I want to tell you, we have tonight in this class, and then we have August 23rd, and then August 30th. And I want to tell you what my plan is as far as the last few classes. It'll be a little bit different than what we've done, and even tonight, maybe a little bit more different. There are some questions that I wanted to make sure that we addressed in this class that I think are important for us to investigate so that we are prepared to have conversations with our friends. And so the last few classes here are not going to be as much of we'll see what we're going to study kind of thing. Tonight we're going to do that, but then next week, we're going to address the question that I've been asked many times in Bible studies, which is there going to be a rapture in the end of times? And so I think that's a great question and one that we want to be prepared to be able to answer when people ask us that question. And then on August 30th, I'm wanting us to do what I just called a lightning round, where there'll be several questions that we will answer, but more along the lines of we won't investigate as deeply as we have in the other questions. And the reason is because it's going to be more like if you were just having a conversation with someone and you really just had maybe 5 minutes, maybe less, to give some kind of an answer to the question that they may ask. What would you say? How would you answer a question if you had very, very limited time? So I have ways that I answer some of those questions, and I want to kind of work through some of those questions that they ask that I think would be good for us to go through in that lightning round. One of which, I've actually had someone ask. This will be in the lightning round in 2 weeks. I've actually had someone ask about when someone has had a near-death experience, how does that fit with the Bible? And if they said, I was so close to dying and I felt like I had a vision of heaven. Well, what do you say to that as a Christian? What can we look to in the scriptures to kind of provide some kind of an answer if they're questioning that? So that'll be included in that. I've had people ask me, their spouse had passed away and they're living alone. It was a widow woman. And she asked me, is it possible that the presence, the spiritual presence of my spouse that passed away, is he there with me in the house still? Like she's asking me, is it possible that he is a ghost now? And so that's something that's worth investigating. I think it's fun. So, what kind of answer do you give when somebody asks you those kinds of what we may think are off the wall questions, not deep theological, but still are worth for us to investigate? So we're going to do that in that lightning round in 2 weeks. All right? And if you have a question that you would like to be addressed, you get that to me in the next few weeks, and we'll include that in this discussion as we're ending this quarter. All right. Okay. So the two that I have today are ones that I had from last week that I wanted to make sure that we talk about, and so I have question 1 and number 2. And if we cover all of them, I don't know if we will or not. If we just cover it all, either I'll let you out if it might be 5 minutes early, or we'll just do maybe a little bit of lightning round right there. Let you ask those kind of questions and how would stump the preacher kind of idea, if you can, which you probably can real easily. All right. So somebody just tell me 1 or 2. 2. Okay. So let's just see what this one is. I don't remember what it was. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. This is one. All right. So do we need to ask for forgiveness of sins every week before we can take the communion for it to be valid? All right. Does everybody understand that question? Do we need to ask for forgiveness of sins every week before we can take the communion for it to be valid? I've had people ask this. Anybody else had somebody ask this? Or maybe you've questioned this yourself and thought, is this something I need to do? And I think that we get this because of some of the terminology that we read about in 1 Corinthians 11. So go over there with me to 1 Corinthians 11, and we're going to investigate that for just a moment. Let me get over there too. All right. First of all, I will say this. I'll give you just a quick answer, and then I'll try to prove it to you through the scriptures. There is absolutely no requirement that those who partake of the Lord's Supper be sinless people. All right? And what I mean by that is anybody that partakes of the Lord's Supper on any given Sunday is guilty of sin. No one is perfect. And I don't think that you can be a sinless person and acknowledge that and be worshiping God without having some sort of arrogance in your heart. You know, the reason that I say that is I think about what Jesus does in the parable of talking about the tax collector and the Pharisee who both go to the temple. They both are there to worship. And the Pharisee is saying, look at all the good things that I've done. Look at how I tithe and I give the way that I should give. And I am so thankful that I am not like that tax collector that's over there who Jesus describes as somebody who is not even looking up towards heaven. He's got his head humbly bowed, beating on himself, saying, please forgive me, Lord, for I'm not worthy. I think that principle of how we come to God in worship carries over into Christianity today. And that when we worship, there's not a time in our lives that we say, okay, now I've got it all together and God is going to accept my worship. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. There's never a time that you say, I've got it all together and now I'm worthy to stand before God. I don't think that's ever a possibility. So that's why I say that the scriptures never really say to us, there's no requirement. We don't see a requirement that if in order for you to be engaged in worship, specifically even down to partaking of the Lord's Supper, that you need to be sinless. What happens a lot of times is people will misread what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 11. All right, so let's look at this just for a moment, starting in verse 23. Paul says, for I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night which he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and of the blood of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and in so doing, he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks judgment to himself, if he does not judge the body rightly. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and a number sleep. I'll stop right there for now. All right. So Paul says here that the manner in which the Lord's Supper must be done is one that is worthy of the sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf. Do you see what he says right here? When we partake of the Lord's Supper, verse 27, and we do it in an unworthy manner, we're guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. And so what he's telling us is that when we partake of the Lord's Supper, it must be worthy of that sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf. He did not say that we must be worthy, because no one is worthy of the love that's demonstrated for us in Jesus giving of himself. Nor does Paul say here that we need to be sinless. In other words, the Lord's Supper is to be conducted. What he's telling us is that it needs to be conducted in a solemn and respectful manner as we remember the sacrifice of Jesus. And when we partake of it in a way that is not mindful of the sacrifice, then that's when it becomes disrespectful, and we're doing it in an unworthy manner. So the idea is we have to realize that what Paul is addressing here is a church who was using the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. They were using it as a regular meal, and there was discrimination against those who were poor and those who were rich, those who had food and those who didn't have food. So they would all come together to eat of a regular meal, and those who were well off had plenty of food to eat. And those who did not, were not well off, did not have plenty of food to eat. And so it became something where the privileged were able to participate in that. And they were taking this regular meal and integrating it into the Lord's Supper. And so Paul reestablishes exactly the way that Jesus established the Lord's Supper. You partake of bread, and he gives thanks for it. He partakes of the cup, he gives thanks for it, and that's it. And if it's not going to be done in a respectful manner towards the sacrifice that the supper represents, then it's done in an unworthy manner. And so this passage is not saying that you need to make everything right with God and you've got to be absolutely sinless before you can bow your head and partake of this. However, I would say that it's not a bad idea, and I think it's a biblical principle, for you to make things right with God and with your brethren if you've sinned against them before you come into worship, period. Jesus actually says, don't come before the altar unless you have made the argument with your brother right. Make that right. Go to your brother first. Have a reconciliation about the sin that you're dealing with, or that both of you are dealing with. Make that reconciliation and then come to God and worship him. It's ridiculous for us to think that we can come to worship, stand before God, and then at the same time have dissension among ourselves. John writes and says that you cannot love God and then also hate your brother at the same time. It doesn't work that way. You've got to make things right with everybody else before you can come before God. So that principle sticks. I think it's right. But to say you can't partake of the Lord's Supper unless you're worthy, or unless you're sinless, or you ask for forgiveness right before you take it, is not correct. That's a horrible thing to do, or to worry about so much. So I've had people say, I'm not going to partake of the Lord's Supper this morning just because, I've been dealing with all this sin in my life, and I just don't think that I can partake of it. Well, if someone was to say that to me, like let's say that right before worship begins, in the foyer, they say that to me. And I've been in that situation before, years ago, 20-something years ago. And I remember saying, well, listen, I would say, if you're saying, well, I'm not going to partake of the Lord's Supper because I've got sin in my life or I've got something going on like this, well, then you shouldn't even sing. don't read the scriptures, don't give. Halt all things that are associated with worship. Why the Lord's Supper? Does it have to be neglected if there's things going on in your life? So it's not consistent. You can do everything else in worship, but you can't take the Lord's Supper. That doesn't work. What you need to do is make things right. Here's your opportunity. I've got things going on in my life, and I don't think I can partake of the Lord's Supper this morning. Well, get things right in your life right now. Ask for forgiveness, and then go on in here to worship and enjoy every aspect of that worship. I think that's important. What we have done, I'm going to ask for y'all's opinion here in just a minute. I'm going to get y'all's feedback on this and questions and comments or whatever. But let me make this one final little point here. What I think that we have done is we have looked at the Lord's Supper as the main reason that we come together. And what we do is we say, well, look, the New Testament church, they came together for the Lord's Supper. Well, that's true. That's not the only reason they came together. If we look at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 25, there's also reason for us to come together just to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. There's other reasons for us to be together besides partaking of the Lord's Supper. So sometimes people will say, well, the Lord's Supper is like the most important part of our worship. And I don't think so. I don't see that to be the case. I've seen people say, well, I've got to leave, so right after the Lord's Supper, we're gonna get out of here. I'm gonna take the Lord's Supper, and then we're gone. And I'm thinking, well, if you were in that much of a rush, just head on out. If you're willing to miss, the preaching, that's what it seems. If you're willing to miss the preaching and the rest of the service, then just miss it all. Miss it all. Or just stay for just a little bit longer. What are you going to get on the road 20, 30 minutes more? Depending on how long the sermon is, right? That may be the case. But give God one more hour. Really. Don't put God and His schedule underneath whatever your schedule is. Schedule your life out where you can devote time to be with the saints and worship God. And don't worry so much about, well, I got to do this or I got to do that. Don't prioritize your own life over the worship to God. So that really, I chased a rabbit with that. But the whole point is that sometimes we look at the Lord's Supper as this sacrament. And what I mean by that is in other denominations, they will say that when you partake of the Lord's Supper, that you're receiving the forgiveness of sins. And that is not true at all. You don't receive forgiveness of sins every week when you partake of the Lord's Supper. It doesn't work like that. Where do you receive forgiveness of sins? There's two places. Where? Somebody tell me at least one of them. Where do we get forgiveness of sins?
Baptism.
At baptism. And after I have sinned and become a Christian, where do I get forgiveness of sins again? After I've sinned again and again and again and again. We repent and pray. That's it. That's what the Scriptures teach us. The Scriptures do not teach us that if you'll partake of the Lord's Supper, you'll also receive the forgiveness of sins. Now, the Lord's Supper symbolizes the sacrifice that is given so that we can have forgiveness of sins. But the act of doing that is not something that you're doing so that you're forgiven that week and then you can go about your life. The Scriptures don't teach us that. Not at all. Okay, now, feedback. Tell me what you think about what we've talked about so far. What do you think? Any other questions or comments that we can interject into this?
I think one thing that might figure into it when people say that they really are going to withdraw from the Lord's Supper is they have a conflict with somebody and they can't forgive them for that.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, Scripture teaches if we're to be forgiven, we have to forgive those who trespass against us.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
When I was young, I remember, I guess I was probably one of the kids in the youth group that most people didn't like because I kind of thought I was better than other people. And I can remember there was one of my classmates. He's actually the same age as I was, and he would do whatever he wanted to on Friday night, and he'd take communion on Sunday morning. And I took it upon myself to tell him how wrong he was. I have a feeling that wasn't what I should have done. But I remember telling him. I would look over at him, and I would go, I don't know who, we did this thing where we would stick our fingernails in ourselves to think about the blood, Jesus shedding his blood. And and I would look over at him the whole time he was taking communion. And in hindsight, I don't think that was a good thing.
That's so funny. I can understand that. You know, I remember as a kid, my mother would always, and I've seen her do this with my kids and my niece and nephew. During the Lord's Supper, even before that, my two kids obeyed the gospel, she would tell them, hey, let's think about Jesus. Let's think about his death. And I tried to do the same thing to my kids as well when partaking of it. But yeah, you're right. We think, oh, I can do anything, I'll sin, but then once I partake of the Lord's Supper, then I'm good again. I don't see that anywhere.
About it, so.
Yeah.
I was staring at him.
Yeah.
I'll just tell you, I was that guy. I felt guilty every time I did it.
Yeah.
I really, but sincerely though, a lot of thought went into that.
Sure. And I don't know about...
And guilt was present.
It was
a moment of repentance and asking forgiveness.
Yeah. I don't want to discount the idea of people saying, you know what, I'm going to try to get my life right before I worship. I think that's a great thing. And I try to do that too. You know, when we get together and we're about to partake of it, that is a moment that I have with me and God around this communion table, this supper. And I can say, you know, Lord, I know that I have messed up last week when I did this and this and this and this. And I'm about to remember your son's death and the whole idea of him sacrificing himself for me to have forgiveness. And Lord, I want you to forgive me of all those things. What a great thing to do before you partake of the Lord's Supper. I can't imagine how that would be a bad thing. But I don't want people to think, I'm not going to partake of it because I've got sin in my life, you know.
I, for one, it's when I don't get the opportunity to take the Lord's Supper, it bothers me.
Sure.
Because that's a moment, it's supposed to be a humbling experience.
Sure.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because it's not just to acknowledge that he died, and sometimes I'll catch myself and I won't think this or I won't realize this, but the humility that you're supposed to come with, like you said, you don't have to ask forgiveness, you don't have to be perfect, but you need to be humble, and it needs to be humbling and humiliating.
Yeah.
The fact that someone that they cared enough about you before you were even born to die for you is supposed to be humbling. And I work a lot of weekends and stuff, so when I miss that moment, it's harder to get through to the next day and the next day.
Yeah.
It's
a good opportunity for a reset. Does everybody else feel that same way? It's like, okay, now we're coming together for worship. Now I'm going to reset myself for this next week. You know, I feel that same way. I really do. I think that's right.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head about how, and I'll say Satan, but the world has commercialized the activity, the action, the work of taking the Lord's Supper, and have made it something, or made it to appear to be something that it's not, and that has caused an array of feelings for people, you know, of whether I'm not worthy or whatever the case, and it really discounts that notion discounts the fundamental of what Christ did for us.
Right.
You know,
right.
The idea that you could even be perfect going, you know, without the blood of Christ.
Right.
You know, is absurd.
Yeah.
You know, pray right before you could say the prayer right after the guy up on stage says the prayer. And just watch your kid. You know,
that's exactly right.
You're not perfect.
We practice, and I think most churches of Christ do, and I don't know about other, religious bodies that may be out there, how they do it. We practice what we call open communion. And that is where if somebody comes in and we don't necessarily know them, we would still serve them the Lord's Supper if they wanted it. We don't ask people when they come in and they sit among our crowd. Well, we don't ask them, are you worthy to be here? Nobody is, right? We don't say, now, are you a Christian? You know, we don't. I mean, we could ask that. It's nothing wrong with that. But we don't say, before we allow you to participate with us in worship, or before we serve the Lord's Supper to you, we want to know, are you a Christian? We don't practice that, and I think that's okay. I don't want us to do that. I don't want us to begin to judge other people whether they can partake of it or not. Paul says, let each man examine himself. And in the context, they were partaking of it wrong. The principle still remains the same. You're responsible for your own judgment for yourself. Anything else? Any other thoughts?
If someone were to come to me with that question, I think I'd say, I think there'd be something wrong with any Christian who didn't feel a little bit of guilt during communion.
Sure.
If you think about it, the Lord's Supper was to remember the fact that because we're sinful, God had to send His Son to die for us.
Yeah.
And so, if you're taking the Lord's Supper, like they did it during Passover meal, and the whole Passover meal was to remember what God did for them.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing the same thing. It's just
Yeah.
He didn't bring us out of Egypt.
Right.
And if you're remembering that correctly, you're remembering the fact that all those sins that I just did this past week is the reason why Jesus had to die. And in Corinth, what they were doing is they were taking the Lord's Supper and they weren't remembering any of that.
Right.
They weren't even thinking on that. And
Right.
that was the unworthy manner. They weren't thinking about Christ's death and what it meant.
Right.
And so that was their unworthy manner.
Yeah.
But people have taken that unworthy manner, they stop on that verse and they say, ooh, I got to make sure that I'm worthy in
Right.
everything that I am before I actually put this in my mouth.
Yeah. Yeah.
I actually had a guy justify closed communion to me with Corinthians.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
I
said,
don't
how
see.
can you know if they're in a worthy manner? I said, it's not for me to know.
Right.
No, he's talking to all of them. He's
Yeah.
not just talking to the elders.
Yeah. And he says, each man must examine himself. That's a individual responsibility that we have.
Imagine if I had the responsibility to walk in and decide if Alex was
Right.
worthy.
Yeah.
Or anybody.
Right.
If that was my responsibility, God didn't give me that.
Right. Yeah. Now
That's a good
there are religious bodies that if you have been guilty of certain sins, then they will refuse giving you communion. But that's where in that setting, when they offer communion, it's one person coming and giving communion to each person as they walk up to receive it. So there's a lot of control right there of that one fella. I'm trying not to be too specific, but does everybody know who I'm talking about? I've seen that. I've seen, communion. Has anybody been to a wedding, a Catholic wedding before? Yeah, they'll offer communion at a Catholic wedding. And I've been at a Catholic wedding with family members and seen some of them go up and some of them not. And the reason is that I had a family member who was divorced, and they weren't allowed to partake of communion if they were divorced. So, and no matter what, divorced, boom, no communion. So, anyway. Anything else? Anything else?
My parents talk about that closed communion
Mhm.
thing. When they first was getting going in their life together, and they decided to get serious about going to church, and they were going around trying to figure out which one lined up the most with the Bible. I think it was think it was a Baptist. I'm not. I can't say 100% sure where, but they get there about to take communion, and they asked my mom and dad to leave. They said, "Well, you can't be in here while we take communion."
Yeah.
And parents were like, "Where in the world is this?"
Yeah.
Or even this is definitely nothing we've read. Anyways, and I read that, and that's kind of, they were stuck between that one and the Church of Christ, and after that they came to the Church of Christ.
That's interesting.
But,
I will say this. So speaking to what you just mentioned and said something about, worship in the 1st and 2nd century was never used. I hate to say use the word never. It was closed worship. And there's a lot of factors of why that may have been the case. But worship was never used as I said it again, never used. Worship was
not typically.
Not typically used, thank you. Worship was not typically used as an evangelistic tool like we use it today. And what I mean by that is, if you meet somebody or you have a friend, what do? We say, come with me to worship. Come join us and be a part of what we do on Sunday morning. We want them there. We use it as an evangelistic tool. The church in the 1st and 2nd century didn't do this. Now, one of the reasons is there was an enormous amount of persecution. And so those who were Christian, they would convert people all week long, and then the church would secretly get together to worship. And it wasn't necessarily, hey, come join us and be a part of this worship. It was more like, become a Christian, and then we'll let you know where we're going to worship on Sunday, kind of thing. So it was a close. And that may be where some of that stemmed off of saying we're only going to let certain people be a part of worship, and specifically be a part of the Lord's Supper in our assemblies. All right. Anything else? Anything else? All right. We've got time for another one. Oh, you're being paged. Is your table ready? Okay, the next one is, did dinosaurs really exist? I've actually had questions about, people ask me this question. This is a fun one. People ask, did dinosaurs really exist? I mean, come on. There's nothing in the Bible that says dinosaur. The word dinosaur is not found in the scriptures, so perhaps it did not exist. This question is good for us to look at today, but it's also one that will probably be addressed in some way or another when we have our Defending the Truth seminar on September the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, which concludes on Family Day. And I want you all to be here. You need to be here for that. That's going to be a big deal. Brother Kyle Butt from Apologetics Press will be here, and we're going to invite the entire community. We're hoping it's a community event that people will come and hear some evidences that are found in science that support the existence of God and dinosaurs and the inspiration of the scriptures and those kinds of things.
Hey, Alex.
Yes, sir.
I got to hear that guy at Christ Quest last year.
Oh, you did? Oh, yeah. You can just go out to World Video Bible School, look for it on YouTube, on the YouTube. I sound like a 75-year-old on the internet. www. Anyway, you can go and watch. Matter of fact, I listened to one last night from Kyle Butt on YouTube, and it was really fascinating. Anyway, the question, did dinosaurs really exist? Now, the term dinosaur, I wrote an article about this a long time ago, last year I feel like, or maybe it was earlier this year. And I wrote a paper about this as well when I was taking Christian evidences, and fascinated by it. I think it's a good one. And people question this a lot. Did dinosaurs really exist? But the term dinosaur actually was not used in in English or really in any kind of language until about the 1800s. It's a new term. It's a new term. To describe the fossilized remains of animals that no longer appear to roam this earth today. while one term is used, it actually refers to a wide variety of animals. The dinosaurs do. But anyway, the scriptures don't necessarily give us that. The word dinosaur just means terrible lizard, is what it is. Terrible lizard. But while the word dinosaur or terrible lizard is not necessarily in the scriptures, there are some creatures that seem to be what we find in fossilized remains. You probably know some of these. There's the mention of the Leviathan, and there's several passages that describe this creature, and specifically in Job 3, Job 38. That's what that is. Job 38, Job 41, Psalm 74. Psalm 104 and Isaiah 27 all mention this Leviathan creature. And then in Job 40, you have the mention of a creature called the behemoth. And in a lot of your Bibles, I hadn't actually looked in mine to see if it's the case. I would only assume that some kind of a note is there. In most Bibles, in the footnotes, in Job 40, 15 through 24 or so, behemoth, let's see, 40, verse 15, I have to look over here. Yes, okay, good. In verse 15 of Job 40, it says, "Now behold, behemoth, which I made as well as you." That's what God is saying to Job. I made you and I made this huge creature. Well, in the footnote, I have a little A next to the word behemoth. If I go down to my footnote, it says, "or hippopotamus." The problem with it being a hippopotamus is the way that the scriptures describe this animal. Okay? Here's what the way God describes it, the one who created it. He says he eats grass like an ox. He says, "Behold now his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly." And here's what gets me. This is the kicker for me. It says, verse 17, "He bends his tail like a cedar." Now, anybody can Google a picture of a hippopotamus. Y'all are all laughing. Y'all know what we're going to say. How big is a hippopotamus tail? Little bitty thing right here, right? Huge animal. Dangerous animal. Don't get me wrong. Dangerous. I think the hippopotamus kills more people in Africa than lions and tigers and bears. Oh my.
But not with his tail.
But not with this tail. Thank you, David. Not with this tail. Well, God, who created this behemoth, says that he bends his tail like a cedar. Now, I've seen some trees down around here in Batesville recently. And over there, I was driving by UACCB today. I think y'all lost like 6 or 7 trees on that main entrance going into the campus. There's a cedar tree that's down, I think it's actually on the border of the land between, what is that nursing home that's right there? Batesville. The Springs. Right there on the land between the Springs and UACCB is a cedar that's gone down. A big sucker. Powerful looking thing. I don't see that thing on the end of a hippopotamus. But I do see dinosaur, behemoth-looking creatures with tails that are as big. The fossil record shows tails that are as big as that tree that I see over here at UACCB. That tells me that what we find described in the Leviathan and the behemoth are perhaps these fossilized creatures. And so my belief, what I think, is that man existed at the same time as the dinosaurs. At the same time. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. First of all, God is telling Job, look at the behemoth. Well, if he doesn't have the opportunity to look at it because it's already extinct, then why would he tell Job to look at it? and notice that I made that behemoth, that dinosaur creature, just as much as I made you. The other thing that proves to me that man and dinosaurs existed are just some archaeological remains of artistry of animals that look like dinosaurs. Specifically, one that I have seen in person. While we were in Cambodia at Angkor Wat, if you look at the Cambodian flag, it's this temple that they have on the flag. Well, we were able to go to that temple. At that temple, there is all these animals that they have carved out in the rock of the temple. You can see the elephant, the monkey, the ostrich. And then you see a stegosaurus. I'm telling you, it can't be anything else but a stegosaurus. How would those Cambodian people, it's 900 years ago, how would they know how to draw a stegosaurus if no one had ever seen one before? They had to have. To me, that proves that man existed at the same time as the dinosaurs existed. And we have biblical record of them, and we have archaeological record of them even to this day. And I think that's pretty awesome. And the God that made that, what he's making the point here is that the God that made the behemoth made us as well. And that's pretty powerful. Okay, any questions or comments about the dinosaur bit? I'm not going to go into any more detail about that. There's so much more you could cover with that. But if someone was to just ask me, this is the passage I'm going to go to and say, yes, they actually did exist. I'm going to go to Job 40 and show them. Look at this creature. It's remarkable. I'll give you one more thing real quick. I have a book over there in my office. I think I did, or maybe did I give it to you? Did I let you borrow that book, Jesse?
Yeah.
Okay. Get that book back to me. I'm kidding. At the end of this book that I've got, there's a picture of this creature that these Japanese fishermen caught, and it had died, and it was rotting, and they caught it in their hooks as they were fishing. And it's like no other creature that man had ever seen before. They literally caught this thing in the ocean, I think in 1976. It looks like a dinosaur. And it boggles my mind. I think that's awesome. Anyway. Okay, any questions or comments? We've still got maybe 2 minutes. Maybe. I don't know what time we got.
Didn't it speak about Leviathan, how we breathe?
Oh yeah, breathe fire. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a good point to bring up. It talks about how the Bible talks about in Leviathan, he's able to breathe out through his nostrils fire. And so the idea is that there were dinosaurs or dragons, if you will, according to our medieval cultures, dragons that existed that could breathe out fire. Just as much as you've probably heard of the bombardier beetle, who is able to, as a defense mechanism, explode out fire, a spark of fire from its rear end to fight off any kind of, which my kids are seeming to be able to do as well. Thank y'all so much. I'll see y'all next week for sure for this. Good way to end the class, I think.